Can a bad mechanic make a good game? And if the answer is yes, what happens if, or perhaps even when, those mechanics go too far? I'm going to describe a group of games to you, and I want you to guess what you think their average score might be. First, we've got a game where, generally speaking, you'll spend at least half of your time grinding. Granted, that'll vary depending on the player, but you can easily push upwards of 90%. Next is a game with random encounters. There's no healing at the end of most dungeons here, and you'll be weakened and exhausted right before you face the boss. Equally, in both this game and another in the group, RNG can be so influential that you'll instantly lose with just a bit of bad luck. Finally, we've got a game that almost seems designed to be frustrating. It's got groups of enemies that can stun lock you and exceptionally powerful bosses that'll even fight you 2-on-1. So what do you think? 2.5 out of 5? 6 out of 10? Well, what if I told you it's 90 out of 100? That may sound surprising until you learn that the games I was describing were Stardew Valley, Dragon Quest III, Balatro, and Elden Ring. If you were to remove what are often considered bad mechanics from these games, and plenty of others we'll talk about, it would actually make them significantly worse. So let's see how these seemingly terrible mechanics are directly responsible for some of the greatest games of all time. We'll use this meter to measure how bad the mechanics are versus how easy they are to justify. In doing so, we can see when and how this reaches the tipping point where the mechanics totally backfire and everything falls apart. Let's start with an interesting one. Grinding. Generally, people don't like grinding, but there's a fascinating phenomenon that happens with this idea. In an almost backwards way, the more a game embraces grinding, the more people like it. This might sound counterintuitive at a glance, so let me hit you with a quick example from one of my favorite games of all time. This is Monster Hunter. In it, you fight these big bosses, and they, like most bosses in most video games, have drops. When you want a new weapon in Monster Hunter, you have to use the drops that you get from these bosses. Here's where things get a bit strange. If I wanted to make this weapon, I'd need a few materials from this guy. When you zoom into these materials, you'll see that they're almost all pretty straightforward. You need a back shell that you can get from breaking the boss's back, wing talons from the arms, and a tail hook from, you guessed it, the tail. It's this last one where grinding starts to come in. This item right here, the Abyssal Dragon's Fire, has a 2% chance to drop. You can increase this by breaking certain parts, and if you're really clever, you can use a Gathering Palico to get it even faster. But all in all, this is an extremely rare drop. Now, here's the key. This isn't exclusive to this weapon, nor this monster. Nearly every weapon in the game requires some extremely low percent drop to either make or upgrade. The armor is the same. While you don't necessarily need a 2 or 3% drop for every piece, you'll often be asked to get it for at least one part in the set. Despite this, Monster Hunter is an insanely successful series, and the people who play it actually somehow enjoy the grind. So naturally, the question is, why? Why do people who play Monster Hunter or other grind-heavy MMOs enjoy grinding when it's so often considered a bad mechanic in other games? It's because the games are designed to make grinding fun. The combat in Monster Hunter, for example, is thoroughly outstanding, and you'll seriously struggle to find a 3D combat system that feels this good. There's even more to it though. Grinding is an inherently relaxing activity. This often leads to it being boring, but what if you really leaned into this idea of relaxation and designed your entire game around the player grinding for hours and hours in a seemingly endless loop of slow, gradual, and satisfying progression? Well, then you'd have a farming sim like Stardew Valley. I'm far from an expert on this game, so I can't make some overarching statement like most of Stardew is grinding, but I can say that in my experience, that's almost all I do. There's just something profoundly relaxing about starting with this dilapidated farm and progressively building it up step by step. I love burning time just fishing at the pier in hopes that I catch something that'll make this number go up a bit more, spending hours in the mines collecting different metals that I'll use to upgrade my tools so that I can work even more efficiently, and of course spending time above ground on dry land in my farm trying to make it as large and effective as possible for no reason other than, I guess, just wanting to do it. That's a large reason why grinding in these games works so well. It's determined by you. It's less like classic RPGs where you have to grind to progress, and more like the game is giving you this empty plot and asking you if and how you'd like to fill it. Going even further though is the fact that in both Stardew and these grind-heavy MMOs, the grind doesn't interrupt the game. It is the game. It's like how instead of creating a jarring break in the experience by asking for subs, I'll just throw in a clever joke. You'll very rarely get annoyed by grinding because that's kind of what you signed up for. Plus, the gameplay is often so good that you want to engage with it. You're not being stopped in your tracks with the story screeching to a halt as you're forced to run in circles for a bit while your numbers go up. No, you're just continuing to do the exact same thing you've been doing from the very start. That's why there's almost this upside down bell curve when it comes to grinding in games. See? When there's no grinding at all, the game is great. Equally so when the game is pure grinding. However, that middle part is where it becomes a problem. That point where the game isn't necessarily about grinding, but still wants to include it anyway for no reason other than to pad playtime. When the game is about grinding and the player is given a choice in how they want to engage with that grind, you take what could have been a bad mechanic and turn it into something that can be relaxing, exciting, even fulfilling, but more than anything, genuinely enjoyable. Next, I want to look at what inspired this video in the first place. It's an idea that I want you to keep in mind for the rest of this, since it'll be extremely relevant for practically everything we talk about. I was loving nearly every second of the Dragon Quest III remake, but in one dungeon about 15 to 20% of the way through the game, I had to ask myself something. Why on earth did the developers choose to include this mechanic? Or rather, why would they exclude it? So in most games like this, you'll get through a dungeon, reach the boss, and rest at a quick save point where you can often heal as well. Dragon Quest III doesn't have that. Oh, and for brevity's sake, I'll be referring to the remake as Dragon Quest III from now on. You'll reach the end of a dungeon exhausted from the 73,000 encounters that you've had to endure, only for the game to then drop a powerful boss on you and say, good luck, I hope you saved your MP. I couldn't understand the point of this at first, but now I think I finally get it. Granted, I don't think this system is perfect, and I'll explain how I'd fix it, but importantly, it does not lack a purpose. This choice to exclude checkpoints actually serves to amplify the other mechanics in the game. Here's how. First, there's MP. Every special attack you do in the game, spells or abilities, will cost some amount of MP. Furthermore, MP restoratives are relatively rare. Not so much so that you'll never find them, but more than rare enough that you have to think about how and when you choose to use them. Next, there's HP, which goes hand in hand with MP. When you get hit, you need to heal. Healing with spells is better than healing with items, since generally the former will recover much more than the latter. However, these healing spells once again cost MP. Finally, you've got random encounters, which act to force the player into a certain number of engagements in every dungeon. When you think about all of this holistically, you can start to see the vision that the developers were trying to achieve. These dungeons are supposed to act as a war of attrition to test your planning and stamina, and it mostly works. Again, I'll get there. So the random encounters force you to fight often. In each of these fights, you're forced to consider how much of a threat the enemy poses. Crucially, these enemies aren't throwaways and are very capable of wiping your entire party if you're not careful. This leads to a choice for the player. Do you want to eliminate any and all risks posed by these encounters by wiping the field with your most powerful spells and attacks at the cost of some MP? Or do you wish to conserve that MP for the inevitable boss? If there were healing points at the end of every dungeon, the answer would be the former every single time. However, because those points don't exist, the answer is a bit more up in the air. Planning becomes a more critical aspect of the gameplay. You can think of how many restorative items you'll need before entering a dungeon. What kind of status effects do the enemies here apply, and can you address them with your spells? If you can, do you want to? Remember, MP is limited. You can't just burn it all healing paralysis when you could have used an item instead. This creates an almost risk-reward-esque system, not just in your planning, but in the encounters as well. Do you risk saving your MP by holding back against a potentially perilous pack of persistent pyramid centipedes, or are you so afraid of their AoEs that you just want to get rid of them before they can present a more serious threat? It's in this way that not only do the lack of rest points elevate this game's otherwise simple combat, but even the random encounters help to create a more preparation-heavy and engaging experience. Now let's talk improvement. I like the idea on display here, but I think it could have been executed a bit better with just a few simple changes, so let's go down the list. First, this system doesn't really work when you consider the fact that you can just leave the dungeon and come back fully healed. This does emphasize that risk-reward idea from earlier, as now you can choose to not heal and just go straight into the boss to save yourself a significant amount of time, and that's what I personally chose to do in most cases. However, it does take a lot of the tension away when you can just decide that you'd rather not participate in the war of attrition or even planning and just leave to heal instead. And on the topic of healing, that's the next small change. I think this is nearly perfect, and all you'd have to do to fix it is to dramatically lower the amount of healing items that the player is allowed to bring with them into a dungeon. The game already tiptoes around this idea with a limited inventory in battle. Each character has an inventory that they can access while fighting that's significantly smaller than the normal one. Imagine if there was a dungeon inventory that was significantly larger than the ones the individual characters have, but nowhere near as limitless as the normal one. You could fill this inventory with items that you think would be useful for the dungeon, and you'd then be tested on your ability to prepare for whatever the game might throw at you. There are some other smaller problems that pop up late game, but for the sake of time we'll stop here, since fundamentally the vision the developers had was extremely sound. Wow, it's almost like they do this for a living. This idea of preparation and tension leads us perfectly into the next game. It's here that things start to get a bit more extreme though. These are the types of bad mechanics that are gonna go from mildly inconvenient to entirely game-breaking. Hades has a near permanent spot in my top 10 list. It is without question one of the best games I've played, and I'd even argue that it's nearly perfect. But I didn't always think that. In fact, there was a time where I hated Hades and all other games like it. To understand how such a dramatic shift in perspective occurred, we need to first understand the source of that vitriol. roguelites. Now, normally I wouldn't separate the two since they're so similar that it generally doesn't matter. However, in this specific case, it'll be very important to understand the difference later, so just know that these two games are roguelites, not roguelikes. Anyway, here's the interesting thing about roguelites. When you die, your progression is reset back to the very start of the game. This is an interesting idea, since if you think about it, this is just an extreme version of a different system that's been all but removed from modern games. You know how in older games you had this little thing in the corner that told you how many times you could die before getting a game over and restarting the stage? Have you ever noticed how those just gradually disappeared from games over the years? There's a reason for that. In short, live systems are generally a waste of time. All they really do is force the player to repeat the same challenges that they've already overcome. These are especially silly in certain games where you can just farm lives to a number so high that the system might as well not even exist. Developers realized this, and much like the lack of post-battle healing and checkpoints in Dragon Quest, they addressed this problem, this time by doing the opposite. With the removal of a limited live system, games were allowed to remain crushingly challenging without wasting time. This can be seen in indie games like Celeste, where you'll often be asked to complete these seemingly impossible screens. Importantly, when you fail, you just jump back a few seconds and are given a chance to try again. It's for this exact reason that I didn't enjoy roguelites at all. I figured they were just trying to pad their playtime by forcing you to repeat the exact same content until the sun burned out. They weren't actually difficult, they were just so overwhelmingly punishing that you barely even got the chance to try. Roguelites were effectively just bringing back that time-wasting live system that I already didn't like in older games. What I didn't realize though is that the developers of these roguelites were fully aware of what they were doing, and so, knowing that they were working with an extremely volatile system, they made a series of brilliant decisions that all revolve around one simple idea. Instead of building the game in a way that would avoid and tiptoe around this potentially awful mechanic, they built the game around it. There are a few unique advantages of having a system so punishing. First, it adds weight to your choices. Hades is a game all about choices. You'll constantly be asked which boon you'd like to receive, what weapon you want to use, what item you'll buy, and even what rewards you'll obtain. Through each of these choices, death looms over your shoulder asking if you're sure this is the right call, if you really want this reward over that one, and if the steps you're taking and plans you're making will propel you across the finish line or lead to your inevitable downfall. In so many games, choices don't feel meaningful. Sometimes that's because they literally aren't. In Hades and other roguelites though, thanks to this constant threat of restarting your entire run, every single choice you make has both weight and meaning. So naturally, you need to have a lot of choices, and this is where the second massive advantage of this one life system comes in. You're probably not going to beat Hades on your first run. In fact, you probably won't beat it on your second or third or even 10th. However, you also won't be using the exact same build on every run either. This is partially due to your choices, but also due to the random nature of this game. You won't run into the same gods or the same rooms or even the same bosses in every attempt. Things will constantly change, and you're forced to adapt to these changes. The whole one life thing becomes so important here because each run acts as a fresh start, a chance to try something completely new and different. Not only does the game give you the chance to do this, it actively pushes you to do so with its random nature. This randomness and variety, along with the weight of your choices, all lead to a third advantage: tension. Failure is very significant in both Hades and roguelites in general. Remember, when you die, you restart, no exceptions. This means that you need to get from the very start to the very end without this bar reaching zero. As a result, every hit you take, every finite resource you use, and every choice you make comes with this overwhelming tension. You have to be locked in when you fight these bosses because you know that if you fail, you'll lose everything. All of this is only possible thanks not just to the limited live system, but thanks to a system where one single death will bring you all the way back to the start. It was upon realizing all of these advantages, along with Hades just being one of the greatest video games ever made, that I was finally able to enjoy the genre. Not necessarily because they fixed roguelites, but because I realized the overwhelming advantage that this seemingly terrible system was able to provide. As tense as Hades can be though, this next game might somehow be even more stressful, and that's because it takes a mechanic that exists in Hades and turns it up to an 11. The only experience with card games that I have are the occasional bouts of severe self-hatred that I indulge in when I play Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. Balatro was a bit different though. It was another roguelite like Hades, and while I wasn't particularly interested in giving it a shot, I wasn't exactly against it either. I didn't really have the time to earlier this year when it first came out, but when it went on sale in November, I figured that would be the perfect time to give it a try. I did just that, and I didn't like it at all. I didn't want to just give up though, so a few days later I launched it again, and let's just say I got literally nothing else done that day. I knew there was a very real chance I'd get addicted to Balatro. In fact, I'd love nothing more than to stop talking about it and go back to playing it, but I've got a job to do. Balatro, like most card games, has a lot of RNG though. This by itself is going to push a lot of people away, and for good reason. RNG isn't necessarily a bad mechanic, but it can be incredibly frustrating. One of the major complaints you'll see about hard bosses in games are their RNG mechanics. Here, check out this example from SMT5. This is Loki. While not a particularly challenging boss, he's the perfect example of why RNG can be dangerous. He's got 5 different attacks, each with a different element. For the most part, it's impossible to predict exactly what attack he'll choose to use here, so you have to prepare for all 5 of them. You might have a party member who's weak to ice, but get lucky and have him use a fire attack instead, or maybe you'll get unlucky and the opposite will happen. The key here is that it's mostly random. I keep saying mostly because the combat of SMT5 is insanely good and you can actually predict a lot of this stuff, but this isn't an SMT5 video. Let me know if you want to see one of those in the future, since I'd love to talk more about this game. Anyway, the same thing can happen with bosses in action games. Most of the late game bosses in Elden Ring are like this. By virtue of them having multiple options in any given situation, they have to choose just one. That one might be an easy to dodge attack like a quick slash, or it might be the most insane combo you've ever seen in your entire life. The reason RNG is annoying in situations like this is because of the stakes. RNG in a game like Pokemon Diamond isn't a big deal since you need about 4 brain cells to reach the end. However, RNG in a game where nearly every single boss is a genuine threat becomes significantly more volatile. So on paper, were you to raise the prevalence of RNG even more, then raise the stakes to the point where one loss restarted the entire game, it'd be terrible, right? Well, that's exactly what Balatro does, and somehow it's not. Instead, it uses what should be a terrible combination and creates one of the most exciting, intense, and addictive experiences I've ever had in a game. So at its simplest level, Balatro is a game about making this number go up. Ideally, it'd go higher than this one, otherwise you'd lose. Everything you do in the game contributes either directly or indirectly to this goal. You make this number go up by playing poker hands out of the random set of cards that you're given each round. After each round, you'll go to a shop. Here you can find items that you can purchase like jokers, which act almost like passives, or planets, which you can think of as permanent stat increases. These, much like the cards you're dealt, are random. You do all of this in preparation for the boss of each round, whose ability is random, exactly. This shouldn't work, but it does for 2 big reasons. First is a level of control. Sure, you don't get to decide what's in the shop or what jokers you'll get, but you do get to build a strategy. You can play around the odds, and while you won't ever make a perfect strategy, you'll make one that'll work the majority of the time. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. Here I've got 4 different jokers. From left to right, this one increases my multiplier when I use even numbered cards, this one increases it even more when I play an ace, 2, 3, 5, or 8, this one will increase it when I play a face card, and finally this last one will increase it by 50% every time a card with a suit is played. However, this suit change happens every round. Finally, I've got the tarot card, which will turn 2 cards in my hands to clubs. I bought this card a while before this round with the knowledge that at some point this joker was going to be a club suit, and when it was, I could use this moon card to get a flush with clubs. And after some abysmal luck, that's exactly what I did. Watching these numbers go up as your plan plays out just as you had intended, each multiplier increase serving to further confirm your own brilliance. You're overwhelmed with a feeling of euphoria as you've managed to overcome the odds. You've somehow found meaning in the chaos, and for a moment, just for a brief instant, you feel like you alone stand atop the world as the one true... I guess that's where the second big reason this works comes in. The lack of control. This may seem like a negative, but this lack of control keeps the game exciting and tense the entire time. You don't know if you're going to win until you do. You can have the perfect plan with everything mapped out only for the boss to totally counter it and force you to go back to the drawing board. Crucially though, this goes both ways. You could have a horrible strategy only to strike gold and get an absurd streak of luck that leads to a win you didn't deserve but will gladly accept. You're given just enough control that your choices feel meaningful, but not so much that the game becomes boring and predictable. This balancing act and the adrenaline rush that it creates is a direct result of the random nature and high stakes of this game. It's thanks to this that Balatro quickly broke its way into a list of my favorite games this year, explicitly because of this insane, almost unfair combination. Unfair. Could we use that? Should we use that? Yeah, let's do it. This is where we reach that tipping point that I mentioned at the start. Let me show you a boss and a game that totally changed my perspective on this idea of bad mechanics creating great games. The first is Melania, Blade of Miquella. Conceptually, I love this boss for the same reason I love Elden Ring as a whole. In this game, you play as the Tarnished, the lowest of the low, a nobody in the truest sense of the word. I mean, your title literally means to lose luster or become less valuable. You aren't special. You're not some legendary figure who's returned to the lands between on a golden steed prepared to take back the throne that was rightfully yours. You're a guy with a stick in a cave. The game doesn't tell you you're a weak and lowly Tarnished, it shows you. When you go to Stormvale Castle, you're told that the front gate is heavily guarded and that you should just sneak around the back. Naturally, I didn't care. I was going through the front gates regardless, and despite the insane odds against me, I pulled it off. I defeated the crowds of soldiers, evaded the ballistas, and even defeated the axe-wielding knight and his lackeys. As I walked past the piles of fallen enemies and through the gate, I was overcome with a triumphant feeling of... I decided to sneak around. See, the game didn't give me some long-winded speech about how it's impossible to break through the front gates and how dozens of armies have tried but Stormveil Castle has never fallen or some other cautionary tale. No, they simply said, don't go there, you'll die, and when I didn't listen, I got to experience firsthand why I shouldn't go there. I got to see the armies of soldiers, the ballistas, the flamethrowers, and the knights. This here is what makes games so special next to other types of media. A book can describe in rich details the intricacies of an area, what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, but it can't actually put you, the person experiencing the media, in that area. Malenia is described as this crazy powerful demigod. She's one of the strongest beings in the world, so powerful that she fought Radahn to a standstill. Even if you assume she lost this fight, which she technically did considering she pulled the whole I may not win but neither will you, being 80% as powerful as someone who can hold back the stars is a pretty significant feat. So when you go to fight her, it should feel unfair. It should be overwhelmingly challenging because the game is directly showing you, the player, that this really is a legendary undefeated swordsman. This has its limits though, and those limits are perfectly demonstrated in the game Barbuda. Barbuda is the first game in UFO 50, a collection of 50 classic games found inside a strange saucer in New Mexico. Allegedly, hold on, wait. UFO 50 is a collection of 50 games being preserved by a group of hopeful indie developers and literally nothing else. Barbuda, much like Elden Ring, could be described as unfair, but if I'm being honest, next to Barbuda, Elden Ring is about as stressful as a summer walk through your local park with a fresh cone of ice cream. This game isn't just unfair, it's borderline cruel. In the opening seconds of the game, this happens. Yeah, it's one of those games. Barbuda doesn't even have music. It's as though it was created purely to make the player suffer, and believe it or not, that does have some positives. You see, this cool thing happens with especially challenging games. Because you're forced to engage with every mechanic in order to survive, you end up gaining a deeper appreciation of the game as a result. As you play Barbuda, you gain this mental map. You may even choose to write down instructions outside of the game. It's explicitly because of this unforgiving difficulty that each and every discovery or achievement feels so much more significant. I mean, I audibly gasped when I pushed this ice block since I knew that I had discovered something. It's like water in the desert or food when you're starving. You don't care that it's not a 5-star meal, you're just happy to eat something. But I really can't stress how hands-off this game is. Items don't have useful descriptions. You'll just get an umbrella and that'll be it. You now have to press buttons and walk around trying to figure out what this thing does. There are breakable walls in the game too, denoted by these cracks, making them rather easy to spot, and by extension, easy to break. Right? Not quite. One hit won't break these walls, and since there's no feedback, 1 or 2 hits on a broken wall does the exact same thing as 1 or 2 hits on a normal wall. This trend of guesswork flows through the entire game. I didn't even know some of the enemies could be killed because, much like the blocks, there's no indication that you've damaged them. All of this is only amplified by the limited lives system, where upon making 6 mistakes, since you die in 1 hit, you're sent back to the very start of the game. This is why I wanted to make that distinction between roguelites and roguelikes earlier. In roguelites, like Hades and Balatro, you gain resources from failed runs that make subsequent runs a bit easier. Think new weapons in Hades or new decks in Balatro. In roguelikes, the game is fully and entirely reset and you lose everything. Barbuda is a roguelike. This goes from exciting to draining pretty fast. You run around the map endlessly, guessing and hoping that something, anything happens before you inevitably lose all your lives and have to start again. What this game is trying to do is genuinely so much fun. It's an experience similar to Outer Wilds where information is your most powerful tool, the type of game you can only really experience once. It's a large part of why I haven't revealed too much about it, since I know there are people out there who will enjoy this game, and I'd hate to take that from them. The problem though lies in the extent to which it's taken. The slow movement, the enormous maps, the instant kills, the guesswork, the lack of item descriptions. When all of this comes together, the gathering of that information can often feel like a mildly tedious task at best, and a full-blown waste of time at worst. This is where Malenia comes back in. This boss is trying to do something similar and ends up making an almost opposite mistake. There's a point where you go from amazed by her iconic waterfowl dance to annoyed by it. The first time you see this attack, you think, oh, that's why she's never known defeat. I mean, just look at this. When I first saw it, all I could do was nod my head in approval, knowing that this boss really was as strong as the lore said. But with each subsequent death, it gradually became significantly less impressive. It loses its luster and almost becomes tarnished. You see what This attack undeniably demonstrates her power, but she's called Malenia Blade of Mikola, not Malenia Blade of one single excessively powerful and over-centralizing attack that effectively defines the difficulty of the entire fight. The problem is that despite this move allowing her to be one of the hardest bosses, that title should have been achieved by her entire arsenal and not by a single attack. Outside of this attack, Malenia is hard, sure, and every boss needs an ultimate move, they're great. But when that ultimate move is orders of magnitude more powerful than anything else the boss can do, it becomes a bit too over-centralized. This becomes less of a fight against the unbeatable Swordsmaster and more of a fight against one single attack. Ironically though, in an almost paradoxical way, if Waterfowl didn't exist, I don't know if that boss fight would accurately represent the lore of this being one of the strongest characters in the world. The same holds true for Barbuda. It's cruel and painfully unforgiving, but isn't it in that unforgiving nature that we find such unique experience? What's so interesting here is that both Malenia and Barbuda are trying to create this distinct experience through suffering, and they both do succeed at that. Where they fall short, however, is in Malenia's power being defined by one single attack, and Barbuda's excessive use of too many inconvenient mechanics. Had Waterfowl Dance's power been spread through the entire moveset evenly, and had Barbuda had just a few less annoying ideas, I would have enjoyed both experiences significantly more. And yet, while I may personally disagree with some choices in some games and the extent to which they're used, that doesn't necessarily mean they shouldn't exist. Mechanics are not inherently good or bad, it's their implementation that determines their quality. Remember way back in the Dragon Quest section when I said to keep this idea in mind? That's the key to this whole thing. We must be willing to ask developers why they chose to include certain mechanics. What feelings are they trying to convey? What kind of world do they wish to build? More than anything, it's important to remember that even the worst mechanics, the most painful ideas, the truly deranged machinations from the mind of a madman, while often difficult to understand, do not lack a purpose. Many people call Malenia artificially difficult, but when does difficulty become artificial? Check out this video where I analyze a certain boss to answer that question.